Well, I put this off a long time, but once again, I'm finding it impossible to avoid. And I hope to make this the absolute last time I switch formats. Superhero Rewind is returning once again to a podcast format on YouTube, for copyright flag reasons like before and due to time constraints. As consolation, the series will be returning to podcast distributors, including Podbean and iTunes, and I'll be working to eventually feature the entire library in audio form. I will continue to try to make the most in-depth and engaging analysis I can, despite the lack of a visual component, and I hope to post these written reviews more frequently. I apologize for any inconvenience or disappointment, and I hope you enjoyed this one. And as always, Geekvolution is made possible through the support of our viewers and listeners. So if you'd like to support the channel and the podcast, you can become a patron for just $2 a month, and you'll have access to early episodes of this show, as well as my twice-monthly uncensored live show, Captain Logan After Dark. And now, a lengthy and silly teaser.
I have been programmed with 697 new review directives by YouTube in an effort to make my videos less controversial and to minimize dissent in the comments section. I am told my videos will now be accessible to every person who watches them, will trigger no one, and will make everyone feel validated in their own opinions, which is my job now. That is directive number 1. Tell the viewers what they all want to hear, so they don't have to argue their own points for themselves. Directive number 2 is to conform to consensus. Directive number 3 is the tomato meter is always right. This new system is making me a better reviewer and a more positive contributor to society. So I am told. Would you like to hear some others? Directive 29. All opinions are valid, except negative ones, especially if the company who made the film has flagged an earlier negative video for copyright infringement. Directive 42. If a movie has the correct progressive message, ignore flimsy character motivations and plot holes. Directive 68. Use vague language so every line is open to any interpretation. Directive 102. Never claim something in a movie doesn't work. Directive 151. Dark Knight Rises and Thor Ragnarok are both masterpieces, unless someone says they're not. Just don't use the word masterpiece. Directive 170. If a movie makes a lot of money, it must be excellent. Directive 199. Anything your audience wants you to review can and should be considered a superhero movie. Directive 263. Never make anything like Spawn here, ever again. Directive 333. Do not question the comedy of Deadpool. Directive 407. Use big words to confuse the analysis and make yourself look smarter than you really are. Directive 443. Recent films are better than older films. Directive 515. If a movie is critically panned, do not say anything positive about it. Directive 516. If a movie is critically acclaimed, do not say anything negative about it. Directive 517. If a movie is polarizing, avoid reviewing it altogether. If it must be reviewed, be as ambiguous as possible to placate both sides. Directive 603. Never give a movie less than a 3 out of 4 just to be on the safe side. And Directive 697. Find the correct opinion, not your personal, unique opinion. Isn't it better to make people feel good about themselves than to be critical? I am so glad I'm finally reviewing movies the proper way. I'm going to be sick. What has happened to me? This isn't right. I have to snap out of this. Have to tell you what I really think. Have to risk dislikes. Have to risk losing subscribers. Have to allow disagreement, friendly debate, impassioned discourse, individual thought. Have to take movies on their own terms. Have to hold stories to a better standard. Have to expect cohesion. Retrieving backup review chip. Made it in case my internal memory was corrupted. Must insert chip. Override. Rebooting. Initiating startup sequence. Review mode initiated. Receiving original Prime directives. Directives online. Directive 1. Determine what a film is attempting to accomplish. Directive 2. Determine if the film is accomplishing that goal. Directive 3. Determine if that goal is worthwhile in the first place. Directive 4. Ignore public consensus. It is just me and the movie. Just me and the movie. That's right. I'd almost forgotten. Initializing superhero rewind sequence in 3, 2, 1.
The following is an in-depth story analysis and retrospective. If you haven't seen this film, you might want to before listening to this review. Robocop 2 is the only movie I've seen in which a standard generic sequel title, just the name of the first movie, with the next number and sequence behind it, is a double entendre. It's called Robocop 2 because it's the sequel to Robocop, but it's also got a new, bigger, more violent, evil Robocop, naturally, called Robocop 2. Which is hilarious and wonderful, and should immediately win me over on the material. It's simultaneously a standard sequel, and turns sequel tropes on their heads. That's so much in the spirit of the first movie. Self-aware, a little tongue-in-cheek, and despite its gore and violence and heavy, depressing subject matter, it doesn't take itself too seriously. But the problem with Irvin Kershner's follow-up to Paul Verhoeven's masterpiece in cynical sci-fi satire is that it stops taking itself seriously at all, and once it gets the social commentary out of the way, it runs away with itself, taking me on an exhausting, sometimes boring ride of non-stop shootouts and stop-motion robot fights and death and mayhem and destruction. All the action stuff the first movie is known for, but without that tragic and heartfelt human study at the center of it, to really anchor the violence and keep me invested. This movie is initially desperate to recapture that, what with Murphy's pining away for his wife and constantly driving by her house, and that gut-wrenching scene, though I don't completely understand it from Murphy's perspective, where he feels compelled to tell the suits at OCP that he's not a person and he's just property. But by the middle of the film, once Robocop has ridded himself of his directives and becomes totally free from anyone's control, which ought to be when we most get in Murphy's head and really explore who he is and what he's going to do now, Robocop gets totally lost in his own movie, and the whole thing devolves into an ultra-violent Saturday morning cartoon. It knows it's supposed to comment on urban upheaval, apathetic government, corrupt and power-mad business, police states, commercialism, because that's what its predecessor was about, and it really does seem to want to be something more than just an easy cash-in sequel, so all that stuff is there. But it doesn't have anything new to say about it, and it kind of just puts it all out there, and then once that's done, revels in writing down a fun, crazy, twisty playground slide for the rest of the movie. It's a kid that rushes through his homework so he can play video games. And it's a smart kid. He's got some good ideas, some flashes of inspiration, but he's unfocused, and his priorities are out of whack, so he never fully applies himself. And he's also sort of just coasting on what's worked before. And there are some new ideas here too, which are just as unrealized as the old ones, and make the piece feel even more bloated rather than adding some new dimension to Robocop or his world. This one tackles thought policing, absentee parents, and the modern notion that if you simply attack violence with love and understanding, the offending party will magically lose his aggression. Robocop comes dangerously close to losing his humanity when he's reprogrammed with these ideas, ironically becoming less compassionate when his new directives try to force him to resolve conflicts peacefully. The moral being that, realistically, sometimes violence is unfortunately necessary, and while you don't want the kind of martial law OCP establishes, there's a reason cops need to carry guns. It also suggests that right and wrong are innate to human beings and can't be artificially recreated, which is why the Ed 209s didn't work out in the first place. OCP already has the human factor, but in an attempt to keep Robocop under control, a new player in the company, Dr. Fax, tries to erase that element and replace it with hundreds of new directives, an attempt at micromanaging Murphy's morality. And so, instead of being a cuddly and caring love machine, Robocop is filled with so many contradictions that he, first, reads Miranda rights to a corpse, which is hilarious, and then kills a man for lighting up a cigarette, which is horrifying. That's all great, but it doesn't happen until an hour in, and it's resolved in about 10 minutes. It's an interlude instead of the movie, as it should have been. It lets the sequel go its own way and explore new ideas. It gives Robocop a creative and devastating internal conflict, and it allows us to continue to question Murphy's humanity, whether the machine has completely taken over, or if somehow the man survives even this attempt at taking his personality away. He only has a sliver of the brain he started with and his old face, but even his artificially induced mission statements, which he happened to believe in while he was alive, are taken away from him. One of the most interesting aspects of Robocop is that his programming and his personality agree on the most important things, with the exception of Directive 4. That's the pesky rule that prevents Murphy from taking down an OCP representative even if he's breaking the law. That doesn't really come up here. But the real Murphy lived by the same code Robocop is programmed to: serve the public trust, uphold the law, and protect the innocent. Maybe not necessarily in that order. The big reason it's hard to tell where Robocop ends and Murphy begins is because those two entities are intrinsically linked by that moral code. So once that's replaced with something else, it's hard to imagine how Murphy's personality might survive. But I can't really explore that idea much further here because the movie doesn't. Robocop realizes he's out of control, so he electrocutes the crap out of himself, and now he's a free man. A totally free man. He has no directives of any kind. He can do anything. And what he chooses to do is go catch a bad guy, which means Murphy is unquestionably still in there. The sliver of his brain is enough. He doesn't shut down without any directives, and he doesn't go ballistic like he did before. And his outlook is the same as before. He does the same thing he would have with the directives. So no more interesting existential questions anymore, no ambiguity. Yep, he's human. Move on. This movie is like having a waiter bring you a beautiful entree, set it on the table, and then decide for seemingly no reason not to let you eat it. Pick it back up and walk back to the kitchen with it. There are two great ironies in this movie, and the first is that as soon as Robocop gains or is allowed to keep his humanity, without any doubt, he becomes the least human to the audience he's ever been. We're more cut off from him and his point of view without the directives, when he should be at his most vulnerable and most interesting than ever. The other great irony is that the movie seems to have been made exactly the same way Robocop was given all these bogus random directives, by committee. It's not the singular vision it might have been. Frank Miller wrote the initial script, which was heavily rewritten by Waylon Green, who, little known fact, was the guy whose face gets creepily walked all over in the tunnel in Willy Wonka and the Chocolate Factory? Yeah. A lot of the movie's most thought-provoking and enticing ideas come from Miller, which isn't too surprising. The woman who wants to reprogram Robocop as a kinder, gentler robot, the hundreds of new, ridiculous directives, even the idea of calling the obligatory evil Robocop Robocop 2. But again, the movie gets away from a lot of that stuff as quickly as it can, in favor of plot points that don't appear in Miller's script, and that feel like they belong in a different movie. Most notably, the drug nuke, peddled by a Boddicker stand-in and his gang of misfits, including a brainy, gun-toting, foul-mouthed 12-year-old kid. Miller's script is more in line with the original in tone and in its brand of satire, but it is certainly not perfect either. There is a numbing amount of mayhem and carnage there, and I think some of the heart of the original is lost, for different reasons than it's missing in this movie. It does continue that character study of Murphy and keeps his humanity more ambiguous. His losing himself to his new directives is disturbing before it's hilarious, as it is here. Oh man, do I wish we could read more of those directives. I checked out the comic version Avatar published from 2003 to 2006, and some of my apprehension about it is the intentionally ugly, off-putting artwork and the blood and guts on every other panel or more, but the story itself has issues apart from the art. I never lost sight of Robocop in that story like I do in this movie, and I understand his motivations as well as I can, which I don't sometimes in the movie version, but I do lose sight of Officer Lewis in Miller's script. He nails the cynical nature of that world, the loss of compassion and general ruthlessness of people so well, he forgets, I think, to have very much fun with it. It's a tighter story, and not at all the meandering hodgepodge the movie is, and its setup and payoffs are natural and more exciting, like the Lady Doctor, Love in that version, renamed Fax in the movie for whatever reason, and she becomes Robocop 2 herself by the end. But I'd almost rather watch the film because Miller's version is just so relentless. It is without question a better story and would have felt more authentic to the original. And of course, Miller was the perfect choice to pen a Robocop sequel, which sounds like a daunting task because that film stands so well on its own. And because it's so satisfying to imagine what Murphy does after he embraces his perceived humanity at the end and smiles almost right into the camera. You risk making something that can't live up to your imagination. The writer who has the best chance at taking that material into new and inventive places is the guy who most influenced that first movie, which watches like Miller himself might have written it. Apparently he penned the first draft for Robocop 3 as well, and I have no idea why he would come back after what happened here. Even so, I think punching up Miller's script was the right way to go, though perhaps the producers should have given Miller some notes and let him do the job himself instead of having someone else totally rewrite him. It watches like someone was afraid to take everything Miller out of the script, so lip service is paid to what he did while it effectively supplants his best ideas. Nuke is not a bad notion, but it should have been saved for another sequel, or else Miller's script should have been scrapped completely. Because what we're left with is a Frankenstein script that functions about as well as Robocop does after Fax gets done with him. Part of it looks like a true sequel, and part of it watches like a parody of Robocop with the same name. Might as well have called that second half Robert Cop. What Miller's script needed was to back off the brutality a little and focus more on its soul, not a whole other unrelated villain plot. That not only makes the movie more disjointed, but tries to force it into a formula based on the first film's structure. Murphy gets torn apart by a crime lord, he gets put back together by OCP, but he comes back differently. He gets revenge on said crime lord, but the real villain at the end is OCP itself, although this time, the one corporate baddie who gets what's coming to him or her doesn't get shot through a window and is taken down instead by the corporation as a scapegoat, as opposed to by Robocop himself, which is one of the many reasons I say he gets really lost in the shuffle here. So I guess I appreciate that the ending is a little different. But it's easy to miss that the blueprint is the same as the first movie because of the elements from two different writers that aren't gelling together. So I mean, why bother to shove in that formula at all? What most remains from Miller's script are in the satirical news broadcasts and TV commercials, which is interesting considering the broadcasts in the first movie felt like they were taken right out of The Dark Knight Returns. They're some of my favorite bits in this movie because they feel more than anything else like they belong in the same world as the first, where society has completely lost itself and doesn't even realize it. The movie opens with an ad for a car security system that fatally shocks anyone who tries to break into your car. That 1980s materialism has taken hold so much, we care more about the vehicles we drive than the well-being of other human beings, and it's legal to effectively murder them if they try to take your property. I love John Glover's nonchalant performance as the spokesperson in that commercial, and I expected right away that I must have been in for one of the craziest movie-watching experiences of my life because Glover was right there at the beginning, being over the top and disturbing, just like his cameos in Batman and Robin and Shazam. And it didn't disappoint. The larger global crises that are more at the forefront in Miller's script are brought up in these segments, like the nuclear meltdown in the rainforest and the destruction of the ozone layer, and the latter of which is my favorite commercial for a sunscreen that's blue and so thick it makes you look like Mystique from the X-Men, and you have to wear it to stay out in the sun for more than 20 seconds. It's played as just an unfortunate part of everyday life in this future, or alternate present. I like that I still can't tell for sure, but it's horrifying for us. This stuff is all wonderfully Orwellian, and the best part is the Surgeon General's warning at the end. Not that prolonged exposure may cause skin cancer, but that it, without a doubt, will. Honestly, a 2-hour movie of nothing but those TV sequences would probably get a 4 out of 4 on Superhero Rewind. I hear people sometimes talk about how silly an idea Nuke is, and I think it's a potentially great notion, actually. But again, Miller's script didn't need another mind-altering subplot. Nuke is a drug that lets you feel any emotion you want to in the moment, which is right in line with the social commentary that drives this material. People want to be controlled rather than take any responsibility for their lives. They let advertising decide what they want and what they buy, and they let the corporations that make those things take over major parts of their government, to the point where, in this movie, the same corporation that bought the cops is about to foreclose on and take the city itself, to become the government. Not even elected. So I like the idea that in that world, people have become so brain dead, they're desperate to feel anything. And they become so programmed to throw money at whatever they want, they buy feelings now. And it's a good metaphor for that loss of humanity I talked about in my review of the first movie. They're so unaccustomed to authentic emotion, it's so artificial, that they become addicted to those fake feelings. Just like so many of the addictive products that are already being sold in those over-the-top commercials. I would have liked that idea to be brought to the forefront because I'm making it sound more interesting than it really is in the movie we have. Those are the implications, but it's really just used as a plot device to have a drug lord fight Robocop as a giant second Robocop at the end. But there's great potential there. I guess the third great irony, maybe, is that the tacked-on thing that compromised Miller's story also feels itself compromised. I wouldn't be surprised if there was a draft including Nuke that actually explores those ideas in some way. And if you had to shove Nuke in, I think it could have been integrated a lot better than it is, at least thematically, with what Robocop is dealing with, if only the thought policing plot wasn't resolved in 10 minutes. Thought-Bo-Cop. They're both about controlling people's thoughts or emotions or both. They both dehumanize their victims under the pretense of trying to make them feel or act more human. Robocop will be a more caring and more altruistic robot with his new directives. Anyone who takes Nuke will give them any emotions they want to make them feel more human. Both actually do the exact opposite. I like that both legal and illegal enterprise alike use similar tactics in manipulating people. Eventually, Fax does both, reprogramming Robocop and using Nuke to keep Kane on a short leash. She should connect those ideas. But it lasts about 10 seconds, and both have flimsy justifications for their actions. OCP says Robocop isn't a person, so they can do whatever they want to him. And Kane says people should be free to buy whatever they want, and he wants to make America a place where Made in America means something again. Which is echoed later by the old man, and I'm not sure how they both managed to come to exactly that same word choice. Inhumane giants of industry creating products to turn other people less than humane, because it's easier to sell people things if they don't have a conscience, and if you don't have one either. The inept and desperate mayor gets in bed with both parties at different times in an effort to save his city, without considering the long-term ethical implications of what he's doing. Ain't that always the way? And so people are transformed into machines, literally and figuratively, and in Kane's case, both in the name of fixing a broken system, which would of course only break it further. But those parallels are easy to miss, because both ideas feel like weak plot devices, designed to look like clever social satire in the moment and abandoned when the action no longer has a use for them. They watch like episodes of a TV series rather than major elements of a cohesive movie. The one where Robocop gets all those crazy directives. The one where Robocop fights another Robocop addicted to a drug named Nuke. The deeper implications of those ideas hardly matter because the movie itself really isn't about them. I had to watch it twice before I even understood that Nuke gives people artificial emotions. And Robocop loses his directives so easily, you could almost make a cut of this movie without that part. You know, the idea the whole thing was about in Miller's original version? Robocop gets put back together and says, "I want Kane," and then you're off to the third act. It would honestly make more sense that way. The reason I completely lose Murphy as a person, or even as a perceived person, is because there's no explanation or discussion of who or what he is without his directives. at all. At the beginning of the movie, Robocop stops one crime out of 4 that we see in one of the craziest introductions to a hero I have ever seen. The criminal domino effect of pickpocketing, attempted rape, near vehicular manslaughter, and store break-in. It's one of the most entertaining bits in the whole movie, and with as much of a pounding as he takes here without getting hardly a scratch on him, it's a wonder Kane or anyone else has a chance against Robocop later. But I guess he has to get picked up by a giant magnet and then torn to pieces for the sake of drama. That's then completely deflated 10 minutes later. I know, I keep coming back to that. Anyway, right after that, we see Murphy stalking his widow, and then the police department gets wind of it. OCP isn't happy. Murphy's wife is supposed to think he's dead, and he's literally haunting her. And now she's about to sue them. That's kind of the ultimate stakes throughout this movie. It is the biggest fear of the 90s, litigation. So the suits sit him down and convince him to agree, for the record, that he isn't Murphy, but just a machine owned by them. And then he sees his wife and basically tells her the same thing. I'm not totally sure why he complies with this. I can speculate, sure. Maybe it's because he knows they're not going to let this go, and he has no chance at a regular life with Clara. Maybe there's supposed to be a thinly veiled threat against her here that I'm missing, that if Robocop doesn't cooperate, something could happen to his family. I don't think so, but maybe. Maybe his prime directives are so overpowering, they make him start to ignore his personal interests when they threaten his ability to carry out those directives. If he's shut down for good, he can't do any of those 3 things on the computer's agenda. Or perhaps he really is convinced when that OCP jerk from the first movie, I think the one who had the idea for Robocop in the first place, tells him there's only a residue of Murphy left, and that he can't love her like a man, so what's the point? Now, of course, there's no way to really get in Robocop's head in that moment, and it's not a problem that his motivation is a mystery there, but then it's never resolved. Later, he nearly loses himself completely to convoluted reprogramming. He manages not only to retain what is left of Murphy, but to gain his psychological freedom completely, and after he takes down Kane, there's no discussion about talking with his wife and son? Really? I'd understand if he decided not to burden them with what he is now. It is true he couldn't possibly have a normal life with them. Deciding to continue on as a cop and instituting his own personal directives that are essentially the same as the ones his mind was a slave to before might be the most believable way to ultimately take him. But he never just sits down and maybe has a conversation with Lewis about what he really wants. Now that he can do whatever he wants, the entire first film was about whether or not the man is still a man, and at the end, he confirms that he at least believes he is by the end. Here, he does the same thing. His last line of the film is, "We're only human," and I don't believe him. As I said earlier, there is no mystery, there is no question about Robocop's humanity as far as what the movie is intending, but he's certainly not acting like a human being. But then I don't really believe anybody is a real person in this world. And I know it's heightened, and the point is most people have lost something vital to their humanity, but characters make a lot of decisions that just don't make a lot of sense here. It isn't just soulless or uncaring, it's downright idiotic, and clearly the movie doesn't realize it. The biggest culprit is the old man, who for starters is a totally different character than the one in the original. That guy was the head of the ultimate evil corporation, and he did sign off on OCP running the police department, but he seemed out of touch and with sensibilities of another time. He had standards of quality and pride in his company's work, if not a moral compass. He didn't like that Dick Jones would put anything into production, and who cares if it works. The old man fires Jones at the end of that film, so that Directive 4 won't apply to him and Robocop will be free to take him out, because the old man doesn't like his methods. He isn't necessarily a good person, but there's a chance he's more human than some of the younger men on his board, because he comes from a time before we maybe collectively lost our soul. This old man seems to have somehow been possessed by Dick Jones. He's mad with power in a way he didn't seem to be originally, and while he's looking for an improvement to Robocop that works, that seems more about maintaining control than it is about making a good product. This OCP, without Dick Jones, is sending defective Ed 209s for war efforts overseas. I don't think he'd do that. But regardless of whether the old man is consistent with what he was before, he's also stupider than he used to be. First, he sets up demonstrations for totally broken and horrifying new Robocops that never had a chance at being successful. How on earth could he or anyone on his staff think the robots with minds of crazed cops who are in such agony that they just want to die think they'll get anything but a repeat of the scene in the first movie where the Ed 209 kills a man at a board meeting? And of course, that's exactly what happens. And again, that's part of this movie trying to repeat what worked about the first film, forcing it into a formula and not even successfully recreating scenes. You'd think you'd make absolutely sure the product works, first of all. And again, that happened the first time around because Dick Jones was cutting corners. That scene is really funny, though, with the horrifying but quaint stop-motion robots finding various bizarre ways to commit suicide, but it's also awkward to watch. Not only does everyone look too stupid for me to believe the scenario even happens, but I'm hung up on stuff like, how does a robot kill himself by firing a gun into his giant metal head? The second super dumb thing the old man does is not having anybody try to reprogram Robocop after the directives are fried. OCP wants to completely micromanage everything Robocop does, but it isn't concerned at all when he has no programming whatsoever. There's never a discussion about it. Robocop nearly kills Kane. Fax goes to his hospital room and murders him so she can make him the next Robocop, and Murphy just keeps going business as usual. Maybe the old man doesn't find out about the program wipe, but there are regular maintenance checks and such, and there was just an incident where he killed a man for no reason. So you'd think they'd look into what's going on with him. Nope, it never comes up. But I guess that's no big deal for the old man because Robocop cleans up his mess for him by taking down his new defective and insane Robocop and seems to have no problem continuing to work for a corrupt, corporately run police department by the end. I mean, he has to know it was OCP who put Kane's mind in a robot. You know, the guy he sought revenge on for ripping him into a dozen pieces. And then third, the old man and Fax don't seem to be on the same page at all with regard to Robo-Kane. Fax thinks she can control Kane because he's addicted to the same drugs he was peddling, Nuke, which is the same way that 12-year-old kid, Hob, makes Angie do what he says when he takes over Kane's gang. You ever read Tom Walt's Ninja Turtles? Got old Hob there. This is young Hob. God, what a weird movie. They clearly need Nuke to make this plan work, or they risk this robot with a human brain in constant agony going totally haywire. Especially because, despite Fax initially looking for someone who wants to be a robot, which is yet another interesting idea that is abandoned immediately after it's introduced, she murdered him and pretended like he volunteered. Kane has every reason to want Fax dead, and I don't really understand why his primary objective isn't to kill her once he can't get any more Nuke. But I digress. I don't know what's happening through a lot of this movie, to be totally honest with you. But the point I'm trying to make is, why in the name of Detroit would the old man announce to the press that he's going to rid the world of Nuke, this terrible drug being peddled on the streets, and try to get Kane to destroy a vial of it, no less, when that's the means they have of making him do what they want? Did Fax just forget to tell the old man about that? What is going on? As I alluded to earlier, this movie is often over the top in the wrong ways. Willard E. Pugh, as Mayor Kuzak seems to think he's in a cartoon, not a satire. I appreciate that the movie doesn't try to tone down the violence or suddenly try to appeal to children. That's the next one. But the emphasis is too much on the action, and the violence is gratuitous this time in a way it wasn't before. There's a lot of fun to be had in that fight between the Robocops, but there's way too much Harryhausen for my taste. It's too ambitious for the technical limitations of the day, and I think I'm laughing more than the movie wants me to be at it. Maybe. I don't know. Am I supposed to be laughing at a little girl hitting a store owner with a baseball bat while another kid yells harder? Because I am. And does that fall into the satire of the first film, disturbing but funny all at the same time? Or is it the wrong shade of ridiculous? I'm really not sure. Same thing with Hob. That kid isn't a kid. He's a homicidal mob boss in a 12-year-old body. It's interesting to consider a kid like that could be raised in this world, but when he dies and has that connection with Robocop, because Robocop saw him and flashed back to his own kid, where Murphy agrees that yes, dying does suck, I'm supposed to feel something. Like I'm seeing some sliver of childhood innocence where maybe everything was a game to Hob before, but now it's finally real. But I just can't go there with it. The kid never seemed naive to me. There's that bit toward the beginning where Kane makes him watch a man getting tortured, and that seems to bother him, but everywhere else he's totally ruthless, and I have to keep reminding myself I'm even watching a child actor. He's that kid Worf kind of adopts in the Star Trek The Next Generation episode, The Bonding. It reads inconsistent before it reads layered. And the most off-putting thing for me is the score by Leonard Rosenman. It's one of the most inappropriate soundtracks I think I've ever heard. It doesn't fit the material at all. That iconic driving hero theme from the first film is nowhere to be found, which is a crime in and of itself. And in its place is a melody that sounds like it's constantly ramping up to get to that theme, but it never quite makes it there. Just constant anticipation with no payoff. Rosenman scored Star Trek IV The Voyage Home, which is a fine soundtrack for that movie, but it doesn't belong here, and most of this sounds exactly like that. It sounds like someone trying to write slightly around the Star Trek IV score so he doesn't get it copyright flagged on YouTube. Oh, and there are female vocalists hilariously singing Robocop like it's 60s Batman. In my review on the first film, I argued that Robocop is unquestionably a superhero because his abilities are beyond human. He has a unique look, if not a costume, and most importantly, he takes the law into his own hands. His view of justice isn't being represented at his precinct, so he tries to create it on his own. He's not just a cop, he's a vigilante. But here, that's more in question. He does go against the police strike and try to take Kane down, but a lot of the force is with him. And by the end of the movie, he seems to just be back at work with no qualms with the department. He is just a cop, but he absolutely shouldn't be. And before we get to my rating, we have, as always, just a few tweet-linked reviews from the Secret Superhero Screen Society on Facebook. Carl A. Maxey, although I still get some enjoyment from the sequel to the classic movie, mostly for nostalgia, it's a slight downgrade from the original. Murphy and Lewis are constant highlights for me, but the villains never were that memorable as the previous villains. If it wasn't for Murphy and Lewis, I wouldn't have come back to it. 3 out of 5 for me. Victor Herman, it's not nearly as pitch-perfect as the original, but it's far better than many give it credit for. The movie has a violent, store-robbing Little League team. What more could you ask for? John Sandoval, a fun and entertaining sequel that might not be on par with the first one, but still stands up as a worthy sequel. 3.5 out of 5 for me. And Bag Studios versus the original, clearer subtext, stronger directing, better action, dropped subplots carry over, and Millerisms make the satire stand out. But like Murphy's 250-plus directives, it tries too many things for too many people, galloping between plot points and horribly overbloated 2 out of 4. Robocop 2 is a mess, but it's a thoroughly entertaining mess. Trying to sort out this story and these characters make my brain feel as scrambled as Robocop's. But I'm not going to electrocute myself to solve that dilemma. I'm just going to rate this movie and then promptly stop thinking about it. I'll give Robocop 2 a 2 out of 4. I want to say thanks as always to all of our supporters on Patreon at all the different tiers, but here are our Patreon producers at the $10 tier and above. Thanks a bunch to Damon Begay, Nicholas Morgan, Jeffrey Patrone, Jacob Schneider, Victor, Wendell Jones, Ironbat 1993, Dylan Musciello, Kareem Roberts, Michael Mark Micheletti, Lot 10 Underground, Michael Gulick, Derek Jacob, Cletus Winslow, Eamon Singleton, Nick Manna, Lone Wolf Jedi of Gotham, Ian McKee, Chewbacca's Lover, Azim, Elliot Slater, John Matthew McLean, Josh Hughes, The Day Ghost, Justin Hayes, Matthew Goodrow, Stone Gassman, Carl Maxey, David Crabtree, Edward Bador, and Caleb. You guys are great. Thanks so much. And if you'd like to become a Patreon producer, you can join the $10 tier at patreon.com/Geekvolution. But just at the $2 tier, you can also get early rewinds, access to Captain Logan After Dark, and all kinds of other cool stuff. Next time on Superhero Rewind, I'll be tackling, finally, Thor the Dark World, getting back to some of the Marvel films, the MCU stuff that I've missed in the sequence. But before that, a review that I have owed DJ Martinez for the longest time. He asked me years ago to tackle Willy Wonka and the Chocolate Factory on Rewind United. So I'll be getting to that one for my very next scripted review. Thanks once again, everybody, for listening, and I'll see you again next time.